All right, hello everyone. I think we'll get, hi. Welcome to Astrostatistics, course at SAMC this semester. My name is James Long. I'm going to be the primary instructor for this course. So I'm an astrostatistician. I'm an assistant professor in the statistics department at Texas A&M. And I've been doing astrostatistics research for about 5 years. So part of that was when I was getting my PhD, and then for the last 3 years as an assistant professor. So I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about course information. This is a little bit different than standard courses that you take as a graduate student. So I've put together a tentative set of topics that we'll be discussing during the course. So the course is going to meet Wednesdays at 4:30. Today is September 7th. So we're going to start off with 3 lectures on time domain astronomy, and those will be given by me. That's because I primarily do time domain astronomy. That's what I know most about. As we go down the course lectures, this becomes more and more tentative. So Yogesh Babu, who is one of the founders of the field of astrostatistics, he's going to be giving 2 lectures on the bootstrapping hypothesis testing with lots of applications to astronomy data. And then October 12th has yet to be filled in. But after that, Tom Laredo and Jesse Suzuki are going to be giving talks on Bayesian methods. And then later, I may talk about spectral data and approximate models, although if there's opportunities for guest speakers, we may insert them here or here or here. So in terms of finding information about this course, I'm not going to use Sakai. Instead, yay? Okay, yeah, I haven't really figured out how to use it. That's part of the reason why. And everyone who I talk to about it seems to dislike it or not understand it. So everything is going to be posted on my website here. Hopefully this. Okay. Yeah, so it's a simple URL. If you type in James Long, Tamu, Astrostat, it'll probably pop up in Google. But I'll have the slides and then some background reading for the lectures. I'll try to post the background reading at least a few days in advance. Most of this, though, was posted today. I also taught an astrostatistics course at Texas A&M in the fall of 2015. So I have a link to all of those course materials here. So if you're interested, some of this will be going over in this class, some things not though. But if you're interested in having more materials on astrostatistics, this is one resource. Then you can email me, jlong@stat.tamu.edu. In terms of office hours, I'll just be available after class every day if you want to talk about this class or anything else. I have an office upstairs. It's 261. And also these lectures will be online. So if you didn't understand something or you miss a class, you're welcome to find the videos. Those should be on the SAMC website. So just a little bit about grading and workload. So everyone who's registered is going to be taking this course pass-fail. There's a sign-up sheet that you should sign. It's here in the back of the room, just for taking attendance. If you're registered for the course and you're going to miss a lecture, that's fine. Just email me, let me know that something's going on, you're traveling that week or whatever, and that's fine. There won't be any homework for the course, but there will be some suggested readings on the course website. My intended audience for this course is a first-year statistics PhD student, so the course will assume some statistics knowledge, but not a ton. It won't assume a lot of astronomy knowledge, but I think broadly you can be at different levels and hopefully still get something from this course. Since it's such a small class, I think we'll be able to tailor the content to who's here. So in a minute, I'm going to try to find out a little bit more about you. But depending on the levels and the interest of students, we can adjust that target audience. For registered students, the only assignment really, other than the readings, is going to be a course project. So I'd like you to choose a project by mid-October, write a 1-paragraph description of what you're going to do and send that to me. And then I'll meet with students in early November just to discuss progress on the project and maybe make some suggestions. And then the project in terms of a deliverable will just be a in-class presentation. So the last 2 lectures are going to be reserved for in-class projects, for project presentations. So I think there's maybe 6 or 8 students who are registered. So for 2 lectures, we'll have maybe 3 or 4 of these project presentations.
Are these projects research projects? Or more like
that's the slide. So the projects are going to be very broad in terms of what you can do, and what I want is for the project for you to get something out of the project. That's the key thing. And so I'm going to have a lot of suggestions throughout my lectures about what you can do for a project. But if you have something that you want to do, just send me an email, and as long as it's reasonable, I'll say yes. I don't want this to be something that you're wasting 20 hours of your time doing. I want you to be learning and then hopefully teaching the class about something. So just a few general ideas for what the project could be. One is you can reproduce results in an article, either in an astronomy journal that's using some statistics, or a statistics article where they're analyzing some astronomy data. So I've just written down a few examples here about articles that I've read that I think it could be interesting to reproduce the results from. A lot of these, they have some code and some data available, and you can learn about different statistical methods, measurement error. This is like Bayesian hierarchical modeling, whatever you're interested in or want to learn more about. One way to do that is through reproducing article results. Another type of project you could do, you could teach the class about research tools, coding tools. So something like Stan, if you do some Bayesian computing and know Stan, you could teach the class Stan. It'd be nice to have some examples applying Stan to some astronomy data sets. Or something like IPython and Jupyter Notebooks would also be useful for the class, and hopefully you could learn something while putting the project together. Simulation studies kind of related to reproducing results in an article, but for a lot of data sets, there are many methods that you could apply to them, and you could do a methods comparison, maybe with simulated data or real data, and talk about several statistical methods for accomplishing something, and then compare them on some data set. A fourth option would be to cover something in astronomy that involves statistics that we don't go over in this class. So I don't know exactly what that's going to be yet because the schedule is still a little bit tentative. But as of right now, I don't have a planned lecture on photometric redshift estimation, even though this is a very important problem in astronomy and involves a lot of statistics. So it's essentially a regression problem. A very complex and important regression problem. So if you are interested in prediction methods, or coming from the statistics side, if you're interested in prediction and regression, or coming from the astronomy side, if you're just interested in photometric redshift estimation, that would be a great topic for a project. And you could talk about the problem and some methods for half an hour. Same goes for source extraction from images. Right now, I don't have any plans to discuss source extraction algorithms or models for doing source extraction. So you could, that would be another good project. Okay, in terms of resources for this class, so there's the website where I will be posting recommended reading. And there are these slides that I'll make and that the guest speakers will make, and that will be online. There's two reference books here that I put up. So these are Astrostatistics textbooks that have come out in the last few years. One is Statistics, Data Mining, and Machine Learning in Astronomy from a group of astronomers at University of Washington. And then a book with a somewhat more statistical focus, Modern Statistical Methods for Astronomy by Eric Feigelson and Yogesh Babu. So Yogesh Babu is going to be giving two guest lectures coming up towards the end of September. I tried to get Jacob van der Plas to give a guest lecture here, but he wasn't able to travel. But these are good books. They have background on a lot of statistical methods. So I think they're in particular good for astronomers who want to learn statistics. If you're a statistician and you want to learn about important problems in astronomy, it's a little bit harder because these books are more describing the statistics, which you might already know. We're not going to follow either of these books closely. I don't think, I'm certainly not requiring students to buy it or even necessarily recommending for you to buy it. But if you're going to continue on in astrostatistics and want a place where you have a lot of reference with a lot of different methods, I think both of these are good books. All right, so I guess I'll try to define what astrostatistics is now. I'm not exactly sure myself, but I think there are some common themes when we analyze astronomy data. So one common challenge with astro data analysis is that we have complex and multi-stage inference problems. So this is laid out in an article that's recommended or background reading for this week, A Framework for Statistical Inference in Astrophysics. This is by Chad Schaefer, an astrostatistician at Carnegie Mellon. But he talks about how when we're doing inference, we start off often with images, and there are objects in these images, and then we want to go all the way to estimating cosmological parameters, which are controlling the expansion of the universe, or the rate of expansion of the universe. And there's many, many steps in this inference process, and we have to account for measurement error and the systematic error and all sorts of different challenges at different stages. So I think a lot of when you go to astrostatistics research talks, often there are these complex multi-stage inference problems are being discussed. Another common feature of astronomy data is measurement error, heteroscedastic errors, and in particular heteroscedastic errors with known variance. So this is, I think, quite rare outside of astronomy, but the norm within astronomy is that there's heteroscedastic measurement error, but the variances are in fact reported. So that I think that comes as a surprise to a lot of statisticians who have worked with heteroscedastic measurement error problems before, but the variance tends to be unknown. Another common feature, a lot of astronomy data sets are large, and most astronomy data sets are growing in size with upcoming surveys that are quite large, such as the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, which I'll be discussing later in this lecture. In terms of data types, astronomy data is often images. So an image of the night sky where there are objects like stars and galaxies in the image, or spectra. So we might observe for a particular object the intensity of light that it's emitting as a function of wavelength. And then also maps. So there's the cosmic microwave background, the CMB, and instruments that measure the CMB. There's essentially a spatial map. And then finally, the questions that arise from analyzing astronomy data tend to be quite complex. And I think what this means is that as astrostatistician, or coming from the statistics side, it's very important to work closely with an astronomer when doing collaboration. So I think that there are other fields that statisticians work in where there's a considerable less amount of domain knowledge, and you can sort of get involved in the problem yourself without really talking with anyone. So one example would be with digit recognition. So a classic machine learning problem in statistics is you have a picture of a digit, 0 through 9, and then you want the computer to label that for you automatically. So this is important for things like the post office. When they take images of a letter, they want the computer to automatically turn someone's handwriting into an address. So if you're working on developing a classifier or an algorithm to do this, to recognize what digit is in a picture, there isn't really much domain knowledge that, as a statistician, you need to know. Like there aren't people don't get PhDs in reading handwriting or in the shapes of digits, right? So you can work on that problem sort of yourself. Without necessarily needing to collaborate so much with a domain expert. I think it's exactly the opposite in astronomy, where the scientific questions that astronomers are trying to answer, they're extremely complex. So if you just, as a statistician, or I've had this experience before, jumped into analyzing some data and thinking that you're going to do something that's interesting for astronomers, and after a couple months of work, they say, you know, like, who cares about this? Or oh, actually, we have some other data set over here that completely solves this problem. Why would you ever do all this work? So I think successful projects in astrostatistics really require a close collaboration between statisticians and astronomers, or at least on the statistics side. I don't know what the astronomers feel like as increasingly you're collaborating with statisticians.
I guess I would definitely say you're right, that it's very easy to think that you're doing things right and actually be doing them wrong on both sides.
Okay. Yeah. So I haven't worked so much with, say, biology data. I know there's a lot of science there, so presumably close collaboration is important. I think with, so for more theoretical statistics, you can, as a statistician, work on your own or just work with other statisticians. And I think for some machine learning problems, often the ones that arise at tech companies, there isn't really too much domain knowledge. I'm not sure if you need domain knowledge to do good research in sociology as a statistician. Some domain knowledge, but I think astronomy really sets a very high threshold, and that it can be very difficult to even understand the question that you're trying to answer. So you really have to collaborate closely with astronomers. Okay, so I talked a little bit about some of the common themes with astronomy data sets. What are the statistical methods that are used? The answer, for better or worse, is pretty much everything. So I've just listed a bunch of kind of topics within statistics here, but pretty much any topic I haven't listed here is probably also used somewhere. I think that's good in one sense. It's good in the sense that if you're a statistician and you're an expert in some area of statistics, like if you love time series, then there are time series in astronomy, and you can apply your methods there, or you can study them. Or if you do a lot of work with MCMC, there are astronomers actually now developing new sampling techniques. So that's good. What can be challenging, though, is if you're really trying to solve a particular astronomy problem, a lot of times you have to be very practical, and you have to be maybe start using statistical methods from a lot of areas, maybe areas that you're not so familiar with. So it can be, it's the breadth of methods that are used within astronomy in which the data require can make astrostatistics research, I think, challenging to statisticians who tend to focus on one area of methodology, like machine learning or functional data analysis or whatever. Okay, so one of my goals for this class is to provide opportunities and to get the statisticians more involved with astrostatistics research. So I think there's a huge need to have more statisticians working with astronomy data, working with astronomers. The astronomers have interesting data sets, important problems. So I'm going to be, throughout the course, trying to provide opportunities, or at least make the opportunities that are available, make those known to you. This year here at SAMC is a great opportunity for getting involved in astrostatistics. In particular, there are 5 working groups that are ongoing here that are investigating different topics within astrostatistics. So some of these names might be a little bit confusing for statisticians, and there is certainly considerable overlap between what these different groups are doing. And to some extent, I'm not exactly sure what some of the groups are doing, because I'm only involved in 1.5 of them. But I'll briefly explain some of these groups now. So there's this working group 2. This is the group that I'm most involved in, synoptic time domain surveys. I'm going to be talking a lot about synoptic time domain surveys today and over the next 2 lectures. Statistically, in this group, there's a lot of machine learning and a lot of classification going on. So if you're interested in machine learning and classification, you may want to consider joining this working group or and participating in the telecon. So I think you can join any of the working groups by emailing working group WG and then the working group number at sakai.duke.edu. Are those working now?
That's going to work.
You're not sure that that's going to work? Okay.
So you have to already be a member of the group to email those addresses.
Okay.
Which is not ideal, but there's an assigned person on each group that you can email.
Okay, so if you're interested in joining, this only really applies to 4 of you who are not already involved in these working groups. But you can just email me, and then I'll figure out how to add you. I'll talk to the right postdoc. But the working group 2 is statistically, I think it's going to be doing a lot of machine learning and classification. Working group 4, astrophysical populations. I think there's going to be a lot of hierarchical Bayesian modeling. Working group 3, time series. Working group 1, I'm somewhat less certain. I guess they're doing emulators and maybe Bayesian calibration of computer models. Okay. So if that's a statistical interest to you, that would be a good working group. And I guess working group 5 is doing cosmology, but I don't know what exactly type of statistics they're doing. Probably Bayesian statistics, maybe hierarchical models. Yeah, so these are 5 great opportunities for getting involved in astrostatistics research. And if you're just exploring, you don't really have to commit to doing a lot of work. There's a telecon each week, and you can listen in on that telecon and participate in a low commitment way for as long as you want. And then if you really want to get involved, then you can start collaborating with people, analyzing data sets.
Can I throw out
Yeah.
just an advertisement that I'm going to be involved in working groups 1 and 4, I think especially 4, and they're both meant to be pretty as far as different fields within astronomy. And so whether you're interested in planets or galaxies or whatever, I think there could be a connection there. I'm being a galaxy person, and so my astrostatistics course is being taught through the lens of galaxy data, basically. And I'd be happy to talk with anyone who has those interests, but I know planets is another big interest of a lot of the people.
Great, thanks. Okay, so that's my overview of what astrostatistics is. Hopefully we can answer that question better as the course goes along. Now I'm going to start talking about time domain astronomy, what it is, and then I'll discuss some surveys that are ongoing. So briefly, before we get into time domain astronomy. We can talk a little bit about what telescopes do. So telescopes take images of the night sky. And this is an example of a piece of an image. So you can see a lot of objects in this image, as you would expect. There are circular objects, which are mostly stars. And then there are elliptical objects, some of which are very big, which are galaxies. And then you can also have objects like asteroids, just artifacts as well. But most sources of light that you see in one of these images is going to be either a star or a galaxy. So one big challenge, it's actually a statistical challenge, or at least in part a statistical challenge, is to compress this data in a way so that we can analyze it. So it's difficult to apply statistical, a lot of the algorithms we want to apply, it's hard to work directly with the images. Astronomers develop algorithms for finding objects in the image, identifying their brightness and their locations. So this is sometimes called photometry, or part of this process is photometry. So you can think that for every object you want you want to tag for its location. So that's the way a location is measured is RA dec, right ascension and declination in astronomy. So you can think of these as two angles. So when you're looking out on the night sky, you can have two angles to describe where you're looking. So that's RA and dec. For each object, there's a brightness. Brightness is often measured in a funny scale called magnitudes. Larger magnitudes are actually dimmer. We'll talk more about that in a minute. When you're taking this image, there's a filter on the front of your telescope, which is only allowing certain wavelengths of light into it. So this filter is sometimes called a band. So for any image, you're going to record what filter it was taken in. And then there's, of course, a time that the image was taken. And a lot of times that's called MJD, modified Julian date, I think. So there's a lot of work has been done on developing methods to go from images to catalogs, objects with locations, brightness, filters. So I've listed a few references here. Some of these are kind of heuristic methods where you kind of experiment a lot with different algorithms for locating bright sources and estimating the brightness. Some more recent methods have used hierarchical statistical models. So there was a talk at SCMA, Statistical Challenges in Modern Astronomy. So that's a once every 5-year conference at Carnegie Mellon for astrostatistics. And one of the presentations was on this method, which used variational inference and a Bayesian generative model for identifying sources and estimating their brightness. So I'm not going to talk too much more about the process of going from images to catalogs now, but this would be a possible project if you wanted to read some of these articles. If you're a statistician and you're interested in machine learning, a lot of these are now published in machine learning journals. So you could read some of these articles, discuss the methods to the class, maybe run the algorithm on a few images. So this is part of where the really big data is in astronomy, because image data tends to get very large. Once you've run these source extractor algorithms, you have photometry. And in particular, we're going to be talking about cases today where you're taking repeated images of the same part of the sky over time. So that means that for every object, at every time, you're going to get a brightness measurement, and you know which filter you took that brightness measurement in, and there's some uncertainty on that brightness. So here's what data looks like for a single object. You can get, say, and I'll show you how you can download this data in a minute, but for every object, you'll get a file, and that file will have a few columns. Here, the first column is telling you the time at which the image was taken. The second column is telling you the filter. So this survey this is SDSS, so it's taking images through 5 different filters, U, G, R, I, Z. The third column is the brightness at that time and that filter for this one. This is all one object, a star. And then the fourth column is a measure of uncertainty on the brightness measurement. So the time domain, the word time domain means that you're observing objects over time, and in particular, how their brightness is changing over time. Okay, so that's a little bit about time domain astronomy. Now I'm going to talk about some surveys that are collecting data in time domain astronomy. So there's a lot of surveys going on now, and I'll go over some specific surveys, but first I'll tell you sort of what a survey is. So there's a few ways that you can collect data in astronomy. I'm not sure if there's a word for the non-survey way of collecting data, so I just called it the non-survey way. But the idea with a non-survey data collection is you think that there's some interesting object someplace, so you have a telescope, so you point that telescope at that object and collect data on it. So like one very interesting type of object is a supernova. This is when a star explodes. It gets much, much brighter. So if you know that there's a supernova going on somewhere, you may want to collect data on it so we can understand supernovas better. So you have a telescope that slews to look at this object, take some data on it. That's an example of not a survey setting. With a survey, the locations that your telescope is looking, the filters that it's using, those are planned out in advance. So there's a schedule of observations that you're going to take. And typically you'll make that schedule with particular science goals in mind. And over the course of this lecture and next week, we'll talk about what some of those science goals are and how you would choose a particular observing schedule. Surveys tend to collect a lot more data than non-survey collection strategies because they're optimized to collect as much data as possible. Whereas if you're just looking for interesting objects, you have to keep moving your telescope, switching filters a lot. But with surveys, you can really optimize a quantity of data collection. So when people talk about big data in optical astronomy, usually they're talking about surveys. Is that fair to say? Yes, okay. So some trade-off in surveys. So of course you'd like to observe everything that there is. You only have a finite amount of telescope time. So you have a telescope that might be running for 5 years. You can observe with it every night, say, for 5 years. And you have to make some decisions about what you are going to look for. So one is that you can do a narrow survey or a wide survey. So a narrow survey means you're only going to look at a small section of sky. A wide survey, you're going to look at more sky area. You can choose whether you're going to look shallow or deep. So are you going to try to find objects that are faint and very far away, or deep, or are you going to have shorter exposures and only see objects that are brighter? As I mentioned before, you can put different filters on the front of your telescope so that you can observe different wavelengths of light. So how many filters are you going to use? How often are you going to use those different filters? If you just use one filter, you can get maybe you can have a wider survey, see more objects, but then you have less information about each object. And then finally, there's temporal coverage. So we're talking about time domain astronomy. So we're sort of assuming that you're going to revisit the same area of the sky at some later time. Do you want to revisit that area every night, twice a night, once a year? How do you want to plan your return visits? So the basic idea is you have some budget for telescope time, and then you want to optimize these 4 characteristics in terms of some science goals, maximizing some science goals. So Tom Laredo gave a talk on, or actually he didn't give a talk because someone's flight was canceled, but he posted some slides on surveys from the opening workshop at SAMC. So you can read more about surveys at that link. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about 5 surveys in astronomy. So these are, most of these are either ongoing or coming up in the future. These are all collecting data. These are roughly ordered from earliest to most recent. So the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope, LSST, is in the future. Dark Energy Survey is ongoing and sort of just started a couple years ago, and Sloan has been around for a while. So I'm going to talk about this to give you a feel for these different trade-offs that I mentioned for surveys. So first I'll talk about SDSS Stripe 82. So SDSS was a big survey. I'm just going to focus on one area that it surveyed, Stripe 82. So if you look out at the sky, you can think about this as the location on the sky you're looking. And unfortunately, I couldn't get a image with just Stripe 82, but Stripe 82 is highlighted here in green, and you can see that Stripe 82, it's along the equator actually, and it's a fairly narrow stripe. Is there a reason why it's not called Strip 82? To me, it seems like a strip.
Like all things in astronomy, there are obscure histories.
Obscure histories, okay. So I guess you could call it Strip 82. I'm not sure. Is stripe a word? Stripe? I guess stripe is a word. Okay. So it's Stripe 82 because it's like a narrow stripe across the sky. So you can see that when you're, in reference to the trade-offs I was talking about before, for Stripe 82 is a fairly small area of the entire sky was chosen. One thing that's nice about astronomy, I don't know, so we have some people who have worked with biology data. What is in terms of using other people's data, is it easy to get access to or hard to get access to, or it varies?
It depends what you're trying to do, but it can be hard. It's not always, it depends on what like field you're in, specifically what like subsection, but yeah, a lot of times it's not as easy as sounds like you're going to think.
Okay, yeah, so I'm about to talk about one of the advantages of astronomy, and that is that a lot of the data sets are publicly available. So for example, this Stripe 82 data, you can download, here is the standard star catalog, which you can download. And then there's a variable star catalog. So so briefly, within Stripe 82, this survey, SDSS, found about 1 million objects. And as part of their processing pipeline, they separated this into standard stars. So these are stars that are not varying, or I should say more precisely, to a rough approximation, not varying. So every star is varying at least somewhat, but the standard stars are pretty constant, whereas the variable stars are exhibiting a considerable amount of changes in their brightness over time. So you can see that only a small fraction of all of the objects that they collected were in fact variables. So you can go and you can download all of the star data, or you can download just the variables. So for the standard stars, which aren't considered varying, for each object you just get sort of crude summary statistics, like the average brightness in a particular filter. For variable stars, though, you want to look at not just like the average brightness in a filter, but since it's changing over time, you want the actual brightness measurements at the times that they were recorded. So that's known as a light curve. So this is a sort of a common term in astronomy, light curve. From a statistical point of view, the light curve is just is a function, and it's the brightness of a star as a function of time. So the brightness of the star is measured in magnitudes here. It's a really strange scale because lower magnitudes is brighter. So you expect brighter to be plotted higher on the plot. So that's why 17 is plotted above 18.5. So this is dimmer. It's like a negative log transform of flux. Magnitude is negative 2.5 log flux. All right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So you can see this is all for one star. So SDSS Stripe 82 found 87,000 variable stars. There's about 1 million stars, and the team there labeled 67,000 as variables, and this is just one of those variables. On the x-axis here is time, and this particular star has been observed for, I think, a couple thousand days, so like 5 or 10 years. And you can see that the observing is very irregular. So there's the first observations are here, and then there's a huge gap, and then there's some other gaps. So there's issues with like stars go behind the sun for part of the year. You have bad weather. It's very difficult to get evenly spaced observations. So one common characteristic of light curves is that the brightness measurements are unequally spaced. And then you can see that this object has different typical brightnesses in the different bands. So band is a synonym for filter. So you have a different filter on the front of the telescope. And you can tell that this is varying. I think that there are actually uncertainties here. So there are these small vertical black lines that you probably can't see, which are maybe one standard deviation uncertainties. And then if you compare the uncertainties that are reported here to the variation you see, it's pretty clear that this star is in fact varying. So it looks quite erratic, or there doesn't seem to be a clear pattern of variation in this plot. It turns out, though, that this star is actually a particular type of variable star. It's a periodic variable star. So what that means is that it's varying in brightness periodically over time. So essentially, this is what we have here is a periodic function. It's a vector valued function because you have a different function for each band. This is the same data, but after estimating a period of 0.64 days for the star. So the idea is you start with this data, you run some period estimation algorithm, and then you make the plot where the magnitudes, the y-axis is the exact same, but the x-axis is time modulo the estimated period. And it's a little bit hard to, you can sort of see the shape here, but the fact that the U-band is so much dimmer, it somewhat obscures the shape. But roughly, this is an R or Lyrae, which is a type of variable star, and it has a slow, roughly linear decline in brightness, and then it quickly shoots up in brightness, and then slow declining it. So you can't see that pattern here because this is over 1,000 days, whereas the period is only 0.64 days. So basically, within here it's gone up and down 10 times or 100 times. It's done its cycle many times. So we'll get to this fact more later, probably next week. But various types of these variable stars are interesting for different reasons. One reason that R Lyrae stars are interesting, this is an R Lyrae star, is because they can be useful for determining distance to objects. So this is one of the major challenges in astronomy. So when you have an object, you of course know where your telescope is pointed, right? So you have essentially two angles which define where your telescope is looking and where the object is. But it's very difficult to determine the distance, which will give you the third spatial coordinate. Many problems in astronomy essentially come down to trying to find what that distance is. And variable stars such as R Lyrae can be useful for breaking that degeneracy. And I'll discuss that next week, exactly why that is and how that's done. Just a brief note on selecting variable sources. So I said that in stripe 82, you had about 1 million stars. How do you select these 67,000 variables? It's pretty much what you would expect. So you can represent this light curve data for a single star D as a set of times, magnitudes, which is the brightness, and sigma, which is the uncertainty on magnitude. So you observe brightness MJB at time TJB with uncertainty sigma JB, where J is indexing the observation number within band little b. And you have capital B bands. So for SDSS, you have capital B is 5 because you have UGRIZ bands. So if a star is constant, then by constant I mean constant, but with a different mean than the different filters. So you wouldn't expect the star to have the same magnitude across different filters. But if it's constant within filters, then the kind of natural statistical model is to say that the observed brightness MJB is just some mu b, constant with time, plus some error. And then you can do some estimate the brightness with just some weighted average of the magnitude measurements, and then compute some residual sum of squares, and then a large residual sum of squares is essentially suggesting that this source is in fact a variable. So this was done in the article which describes how they separated the standard stars from the variable stars. They computed a residual sum of squares for each star in each band. Astronomers like to call this chi-squared. So usually when astronomers talk about chi-squared minimization, they're usually minimizing some sum of squares. Essentially, a lot of times it's maximum likelihood, but with a normal measurement error model. But the term, it's not really referring to like a chi-squared distribution as we think of in statistics.
So you need to explain how is chi-squared different? I don't understand.
So I think so astronomers often write out chi-squared and then it equals, and then they have some sum of squares. There's a sum sign, and then there's
a sum of differences from a model divided by sum of squares.
So that would be, and then the sums are weighted by some sigma, right?
Yeah, like 1 over sigma squared.
Yeah. So and then you find the values of the parameters which minimize that. Okay. Typically, right? So astronomers say chi-squared minimization, right?
So a statistician wouldn't call that a chi-squared?
So no, I think a statistician would say that they're doing maximum likelihood estimation and that there's a normal measurement error model.
So the thing we call chi-squared doesn't actually have a name as an entity?
It's maximum likelihood with normal measurement error.
Okay.
Is that what other statisticians have found who have analyzed astronomy data? David, I'm looking at you.
Yeah, that's something I know.
Okay.
Interesting.
So I think is what we call chi-squared isn't necessarily what the astronomers call chi-squared. Most things where the term has a slightly different usage.
Well, I did notice that, and this confused me at first, that if you Google online chi-squared, you always get the chi-squared for the special case of a Poisson distribution.
Yeah,
I guess that's coming out of the stats literature. But then
Well, chi-squared, when statisticians say chi-squared, usually they're referring to a chi-squared distributed random variable. Whereas astronomers seem to think of it as like an objective function which you minimize.
So we think of like that if you have a chi-squared, if you did a Monte Carlo experiment 1 million times and you measured the chi-squared from each one, it would make up the chi-squared distribution. Like the specific chi-squared is sampled from the chi-squared distribution.
Okay, so you do that 1,000 times, and every time you fit the parameters, and then you plug in the fitted parameters, and then you look at the sum of squares there. And then you're saying that that is going to be chi-squared with some degrees of freedom. A lot of times that degrees of freedom would be n minus the number of parameters. Yeah, so I think for a lot of models that would be the case.
Yeah, but what's
for like
weird
linear models.
that I got confused by, but it sounds like you're talking about a separate issue, is that it looks like the statistics chi-squared is always taught starting from the assumption that sigma squared is equal to n. So it's like the
Sigma squared equals to n.
I don't know, if you just Google it online, like chi-squared is online is always, instead of being sigma squared in the denominator, it would be like n. So it's this,
Like n minus 1?
no, like n, the number of
So like there's no
objects,
there's
or
no
the number of counts.
there's no sigma here.
Just like it's a special case of a response where sigma squared equals n. If you Google it online, I don't know why, but that's just the most common thing you find online.
Okay.
The only thing I can think of would be like trying to analyze a contingency table where you've got like observed minus. That's going to come up
Okay.
most often when you look
Yeah.
at like just Google chi-square. That's your standard categorical data analysis tool that they teach.
Yeah, that must be why. It must be from like basic intro accounting.
That's the only thing I can think of that would come up and kind of look and sound like what you're saying.
But the way astronomers and physicists use it is what you said. They measure it from fits.
Yeah, so I think that
Yeah,
the astronomers a lot of times they don't talk about like what the model is. They talk about they're going to minimize something, right? Like you're going to minimize chi-squared. But statisticians tend to think about, well, what's the model for the data? And then I'm going to estimate some parameters in that model. So here is a very simple statistical model. And then the parameter to estimate is mu b. And then this is essentially using the residual sum of squares, or you could do some sort of, it's essentially a hypothesis test where if the residual sum of squares is large, you're rejecting there's a sort of a null hypothesis here that this is true, an alternative hypothesis that's not constant.
Right. And so the cool
So statisticians, they always think like, what's the model? And then they estimate parameters in that model. Frequentists tend to use like maximum likelihood estimation, and Bayesians tend to put a prior on the parameters, compute a posterior, and then summarize the posterior. But like the model is the key thing for statisticians, where I think for astronomers it's more like some function that they're minimizing, like chi-squared.
I think you're generally true, but I do have like a Monte Carlo tutorial where I actually focus on the fact that the specific chi-squared, which is what you're talking about, is actually drawn from the chi-squared distribution, and that's actually interesting because it means that if you have a deviation from like a reduced chi-squared of 1, which is supposedly a good fit, you can actually quantify like at what confidence, you know. Yeah. So I think we're sort of speaking the same language, even though it sounds weird.
Yeah, like different terms. Nice. Okay, so that was what was done to, or something like this is often done to identify the variable stars in a survey. Okay, so that was a little bit about the SDSS Stripe 82. Another survey is that's talked about a lot is the optical gravitational lensing experiment. So that focused on two clouds called the Small Magellanic Cloud and the Large Magellanic Cloud. These are, I think they're satellite galaxies of the Milky Way. And so they're small galaxies, sort of with, so the Earth and the Sun and our solar system is in the Milky Way galaxy. And then there's some small galaxies or galaxy remnants that are either in the Milky Way or orbiting the Milky Way. So these are two of the largest sort of sub-galaxies. So they're a tightly bound collection of stars that are within the Milky Way. Is that correct?
Okay.
Okay. And so the optical gravitational lensing experiment observed the SMC and the LMC and the galactic bulge. So what kind of data did Ogle get? So OGLE only observed with 2 filters, or 2 bands, the I and the V bands, whereas SDSS Stripe 82 was getting 5 bands of data. You can see that, so here's an example of one of the light curves from OGLE. They got a lot more data in the I band, so the left y-axis is for the I band, and you can see that they got hundreds of measurements in I band and many fewer in V band. OGLE found 400,000 variable stars and a whole lot of non-variables, I assume. I don't have the number here. And again, all of this data is public, so you can go to this website and you can download all of these light curves, and we'll talk about some of the things you might do with those once you download them. Okay, so that's 2 of 5 surveys I'm talking about. So 2 of the SDSS Stripe 82 and OGLE, they had a lot of different science objectives. One of the big, I guess, accomplishments of OGLE was to find a lot of these variable stars, like the Aurora Lyrae that I mentioned earlier. Kepler was a space telescope. And Kepler had a very specific goal. So unlike OGLE and SDSS Stripe 82, which kind of had general goals, Kepler was specifically trying to find extrasolar planets. So these are planets that are orbiting stars other than the sun. And the entire survey was designed with this in mind. So how do you find extrasolar planets? Well, the method that Kepler used is called the transiting method. I have a 3rd grade level animation of this here. Okay, so with the transiting method, the idea is that Kepler is looking at at a star, and there's maybe a planet orbiting that star. And if that planet goes between the line of sight between the star and Kepler, then we expect the brightness to decrease when the planet goes in front. So there's an eclipse, essentially. You don't expect a large decrease because the planets are typically small relative to the size of the star. But anyway, so Kepler is monitoring the star and then sending data back to Earth, and you can see that typically the star has this 1 level of brightness, but then when there's an eclipse, it dips down. So in order to do this, it's important to have to take measurements very often of the star. So with the OGLE and the SDSS data that I was talking about, those had very long times between magnitude measurements. But Kepler monitored each star every 30 minutes. So every 30 minutes it took a brightness measurement. So this is much more dense sampling of the star brightness than the 2 previous surveys I talked about. It also only used 1 filter, and it only observed a total of 145,000 stars. So you can see that there's a trade-off here where Kepler is deciding to get sort of a small number of, it's collecting data on a fairly small number of stars, where SDSS and OGLE were getting millions. Kepler is getting only 145,000 stars, but it's only getting them in 1 filter, but it's observing them very, very high density, or very high sampling rate. So this is one example of a Kepler light curve. So you can see how dense the sampling is here, that like within one of these chunks, there's hundreds or dozens of brightness measurements. And this is an example of a light curve where it's very clear that there's this transiting phenomenon. You can see it at different times. So there's a planet transit about every 3 days. Other examples of, there are 145,000 of these light curves. In many other cases, it's harder to find the planets because the signal is much fainter. Okay, so now I'll talk about the last 2 surveys. So the dark energy survey. The dark energy survey was to investigate the large-scale structure of the universe using several tools. So type 1a supernova, baryon acoustic oscillations, galaxy clusters, and weak gravitational lensing. So in terms of finding supernova, does maybe one of the statisticians can try to answer this? So what would be a good observing strategy for supernova? So like what do you have to, if you want to find supernova, is there some way in which you'd have to take data? So a supernova, basically if supernovas tend to be far, they're stars that at the end of their life blow up and greatly increase in brightness. So typically if you're looking at this star before it's blown up, before it's gone supernova, it will be so faint that you can't see it. It'll be below the threshold for observing. And then once it goes off, it's going to get bright like in an instant. It's essentially an explosion. And then it gets dim quite quickly. So over the course of a few days, it's significantly decreased in brightness. So if you want to find these, it tends to be, and you're doing a survey, you want to have measurements that are not too far apart in time. So for example, taking an image now and then taking an image a year from now and then taking an image a month from then, you're not going to be able to see, you're not going to be able to detect that supernova very quickly after it went off. You want to have an image where you don't see anything, an hour later, an image where you see something bright, and then you know that within that last hour that supernova went off, and then you can go and collect further data on that supernova from a different telescope. So
if you have dense enough lightly sparse data set, then probably if you're feeding a model up to a certain time, then you also have a change point in that model that might signify a supernova.
So you see nothing for a while, and then you take a measurement on it?
You're seeing one model for a while, then after a certain time, suddenly the model is changed. The change point happens at some point.
Mm-hmm.
So that change point might signify supernova based on
yeah.
what supernova means.
Yeah. So here's the DES observing the area that it's observing. So this is the celestial sphere. The black line indicates the observing region. So it has a very strange, irregular observing region. There's some reasons for that. So one is that it's observing this area because it wants to overlap with the SDSS data that I talked about earlier. And the idea is then that you can calibrate your instruments against previous data. So that's nice. All of the data is being taken in the southern hemisphere. That's because this telescope is in Chile, so you can't actually see the sky way up here. So you have to mostly be looking down. And there are these small yellow regions, which are called the Supernovae Fields. So most of the survey is not supernova fields, but there are some very small ones, yellow circles here. So DES has a different observing strategy in the supernova fields and in the non-supernova fields. So this is an example of taking data in the supernova fields where they are. The DES is an ongoing survey, so there's only about 1 year or 2 years, yeah, more than 1 year of data collection. And you can see that for the supernova fields, they are re-observing them without maybe too much time lapse, just a few days, maybe even some on the same night here. So that's what's going on in these regions of the sky. Very, very small regions, but they're re-imaging those regions. And then for other regions, the wide field. So the wide field is like everything other than these small yellow areas. It's much sparser, so they're collecting much less data per object. So there's kind of even within a single survey, you have different observing strategies And the idea is that the supernova fields will be useful for finding supernova, and that the wide field, if you made every area a supernova field, then you could only see a very small fraction of the sky, right? Because you'd be using all of your telescope time on that very small area. So there's a kind of a compromise there between, for some very small areas, they observe them a lot, and then for a much wider area, they observe more sparsely. Okay, and then finally, the project that I think is going to, or is revolutionizing astronomy is the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope. So this is not started yet. It is being constructed right now. It is scheduled to make first light, so I think that means it's going to be taking its first images in 2019. There's a wide range of science goals, and the quantity of data is really going to be unprecedented, so probably it's going to collect more data than, I guess, all of the surveys I've talked about so far. Is that fair to say?
I don't know the numbers, but
people say things like that. So, yeah, like it will collect more data than every survey combined has collected. Sounds like something. Sounds like it could be true. So a lot. If you go to talks on astrostatistics or hear astronomers talk, there's a lot of planning going on for LSST, even though it hasn't started yet. There's so much infrastructure that needs to be developed that there's statistical methods being developed for LSST. There's data analysis pipelines. Lots of work is being done there. Okay, so just a summary of what I talked about. There's a large and growing amount of data. The data have very different qualities based on science goals. So some surveys are taking very dense light curves, other ones are very sparse. There's at least two ways to think about this data. One, if you're interested in time series, there's clearly a time series aspect to this. The other way I think of that some people, or the other area of statistics people are using for time domain surveys, is to think about these as functional data sets. So the functional data analysis, FDA, there's books on that in statistics, and some of those methods can be useful for analyzing these data sets. Okay. All right, so I think we'll take a 5-minute break, and then I will talk about machine learning methods and classification of variable stars. So we'll resume at, okay. So now I'm going to start the second part of the lecture, talking about automated variable source classification, methods and challenges. So this kind of picks up where the first part of the lecture left off. So the data sets and the surveys in astronomy, they're growing in size. So one survey I didn't talk about was Hipparcos. That was from the late 80s and the early 90s. That was a space-based mission run by ESA, the European Space Agency. And I'm not sure how many total stars it observed, but they, after some analysis, they found a few thousand, 2,712 periodic variable stars. So when you have a data set that size, once you've done some cuts and gotten a few thousand, 3,000 or so variable stars, if you're interested in studying them, it's feasible. Maybe not particularly exciting, but it's feasible to actually look at every one of them and say, this one has this interesting feature, that one has that interesting feature. But clearly, as data sets have grown, that is no longer possible. With Ogle, which I talked about, that discovered something on the order of 400,000 variable stars. And now surveys are collecting millions and soon to be billions. So these stars, these light curves, they belong to different classes, which represent, to some extent, their underlying reason for variability. So I've put one variable star on this slide. This variable star belongs to the class Myra. So this is a pulsating red giant. There's some interesting features associated with this function. So one is, you can see it's at least quasi-periodic, so it has this kind of period here that seems fairly stable, but it's not a strictly periodic function. You can see that the maximum brightness is varying. So that's caused by dust. So this star, the dust accumulates around it, and then that causes some dimming, at least in whatever filter we're observing now, I think I-band. And then that dust blows away, and then the star will get brighter. So you could think of this as maybe as a sine function, roughly, and then but that sine function has a mean which is slowly changing over time. Myras tend to have very long periods, hundreds of days plus. So this the time scale here is about 3,000 days, and you can actually see the periods. They're also high amplitude, so they vary by more than a magnitude. Another example, or a very different class of variable stars, are aurora Lyrae. So I showed an example in the first part of this lecture of an aurora Lyrae. So the top plot is the raw light curve for the aurora Lyrae. So on the y-axis is magnitude, and the x-axis is time in days. And it doesn't look like there's a pattern here. That's because it is actually varying in a very predictable way, in a periodic way, but you can't see that period because the period is so short. But if you estimate a period and then look at what's called the folded light curve, so this is the folded light curve, magnitude versus time modulo period, then you can see this clear pattern of brightness variation. So aurora Lyrae are quite different than Myras. They have much smaller amplitude of variation, and they have much shorter periods, so periods on the under a day. There's actually a huge set of types of these variable stars, or just variable objects. And there's sort of a hierarchical structure here. This slide was made by Laurent Ayer, who's well known in the variable star community. So some stars are variables for extrinsic reasons. So this would be the case if you have an eclipsing binary pair. So this is when you have two stars that are orbiting each other, and then when one is in our line of sight, then we can't see the light from the other star, and then there's a dimming in brightness. It's exactly like exoplanet transiting, except the signal is much, much larger because stars are bigger and they emit light themselves. So this category is, so in terms of varying objects, there's objects that are varying extrinsically, there are stars, and then here's eclipsing binaries. And then there's subtypes here. So sometimes you have binary stars that are like touching each other or sharing mass, and other times you have ones that are well separated. So those would be kind of separate subcategories of eclipsing binaries. So depending on how you want to cut this up, there's maybe 30 or 40 classes if you go to the bottom of the tree, or you can just think about there being 5 or 10 much larger, broader classes. Okay, so I suppose the statisticians can see where this is going in terms of a classification problem, but just to make this concrete and in terms of my own research, so one example where you want to do classification of variable stars, or where I have wanted to, is with a data set collected on M33. So M33 is a galaxy that is near the Milky Way, our own galaxy. This is a picture of M33. So a telescope, I think a pair of telescopes, Direct and Win, that's not important, but those are the telescope names. Those two telescopes, they observed this galaxy a bunch of times. I guess they observed most of the galaxy, and then they observed most of the galaxy over time. So you have, for every star in that galaxy, you have a set of brightness measurements. So we have about we identified 100,000 stars as being, we thought that were variable in M33. And we have about 30 observations per source, so per object in the I band. So we have single band data. I talked about earlier how you can have a lot of different filters, but this is just single filter data. And there's a mix of stuff in these 100,000. So there's some Myras, which are the class I talked about before. There's actually subtypes of Myras, O-rich or C-rich. O and C stand for oxygen and carbon. And then there are other types of variables. So Cepheids is another type of variable star. There's just junk there, things that like aren't varying, where you had just bad photometry, all sorts of things. And the goal is to take these 100,000 variable sources, find or our particular goal was to take these 100,000, identify which are Myras, and actually subclassify into O-rich and C-rich Myras, and determine something called a period-luminosity relation for those Myras. So this is, I'm not going to talk about this right now. I will talk about it more next week. But an important thing to keep in mind, and I mentioned this earlier, is that these tend to be multi-stage inference problems. So one way to think about this is that my goal is just to find the O-rich and C-rich Myras in M33. But if you're thinking the way astronomers do, it's not that you just end there. It's not that, oh, I found here are the O-rich and C-rich Myras in M33. You want to do something with those O-rich and C-rich Myras in M33. So this is a classification task, but it's a bit different than the way we might think of, say a spam classifier. So Google your inbox has a classifier. Google has a classifier where it's assigning some emails to the spam folder and some emails to the not spam folder. But there isn't necessarily a lot of follow-up that Google is doing with the spam or not spam. Whereas after astronomers do this classification, there's actually a specific inference task. We're going to take the objects that we have labeled as O-rich and C-rich Myras and estimate something called a period-luminosity relationship. So we want to keep that in mind now, and then we'll talk about that much more next week or 2 weeks from now. This is an example of what, these look purple, but they're not. Yeah, they're not purple. Okay, so everything should be black in this plot. So this is an example of what quality data we have. So if you go back here and you look at this star, I think if you asked an astronomer what star is this, any one of them is going to be able to say this is a Myra. It's pretty clear. But data this quality is much harder to work with. So the earlier plot was an example of a Myra from Ogle, which took fairly high quality data. This is a example of some star, it could be a Myra, from M33. Okay, so astronomers, I think it's a fairly popular topic within the time domain literature, have been working on and are using statistical classifiers. So these are machine learning and statistical tools developed by the statistics and computer science communities, and they're now using these to build classifiers for these variable stars. So I'm going to give an overview of how this process works. The general idea is quite similar to how classifiers work in a lot of domains outside of astronomy. So, just the way that Google may classify your email. But there are some particular details, and in fact important details that are fairly specific to astronomy or not typical in other classification problems. So how does statistical classification work, or how have most people been using it to classify these variable stars? So first, we start off with some training data. So these would be light curves of a known class. So for example, the Ogle team has classified all of its variable sources through a mixture of, I think, human effort and kind of cuts on different features. And then there's an unlabeled data set, which is a set of light curves where we don't know their class. I think it's a little, so usually in statistics, people would call this a test data set, right? I somewhat hesitate to use that word because in statistics literature, when people talk about the test and the training and the test data, usually those are IID by construction, right? So you started off with some big data set and you randomly selected some subset of it to be training, and then you have some other set to be test, right? Yeah, okay, so mostly nods from the statistician.
Sorry, remind me what IID stands for.
Independent, identically distributed. So the idea is that in statistics, the training data and your test data, they have the same characteristics by construction, because you started off with 1,000 objects and you made 800 of them training and you made 200 of them test. There's no difference between them. You used a random number to assign them on your computer. And I want to emphasize that that's not necessarily the case here. We have training data that could be ogle data, which are these really well-observed light curves. And then our unlabeled data is say stars that we observed in M33, which, the fundamental populations could be different, and certainly the sampling is different. Quality is different. So how does classification work, or how have astronomers been doing classification? So it's fairly straightforward. There's usually a feature extraction step. So this is where we input a lot of our astronomy knowledge. So we know that certain characteristics of these functions, of these light curves, are useful for separating classes. So in particular, period, Myras have long periods, Aurellari have short periods, amplitudes, derivatives, all sorts of things. So then we get essentially a matrix. So we start off with these objects which are, I would call them unstructured as a statistician. So these light curves, they're functions that are sampled at irregular intervals. They don't fit nicely into a matrix or anything. But once we do feature extraction, we can think of every object as being a row and the columns as being features. And that's where the setting or the type of data where statisticians and computer scientists have developed a lot of methods called classifiers. So what does a classifier do? Well, you use your training data to essentially make this function C hat. And then C hat is a function from feature space to the set of classes. So the training data, you use the training data to construct this function C hat, and I'll talk about how to do that for one particular classifier in a minute. And then once you have this function C hat, you then apply it to the unlabeled data. So you have your unlabeled data, you compute features for your unlabeled data, and then you use C hat to predict the classes.
Could you go directly, without measuring features, could you just go directly from the light curves?
Yeah, there's fewer methods for doing that, and I think for light curves it's particularly hard because well, for sparsely sampled light curves, it's particularly hard. What people can and do is, so suppose you have, suppose you're doing classification of periodic variables. So you can, if they're decently sampled, you can estimate a period pretty well for all of them, and then you get these periodic functions. And you can fit splines or some method to all of the functions. And then you can do the classification, I guess, through the coefficients. You're sort of using the coefficients as features in that case. I think what would be more, and I may get to this towards the end of this lecture, the natural, or the alternative strategy to what I'm going to describe to feature extraction would be model building for the classes. And that's harder, but maybe potentially gives you better classification performance. So if you think you have models that describe how these light curves vary, you can fit those models to, so for a particular star, you don't know what class it belongs to, maybe it belongs to one of two classes. If you have a statistical model for each of those class, you can then fit each of those models and then compute something like a likelihood ratio or a Bayes factor and then make a classification decision based on that. And that is used to some extent. I think for some of these classes of variables, it's very hard to come up with a good model. And computationally, that can get pretty nasty. So you're having millions of objects, and then maybe you have 20 or 30 models, each one for these different classes, which means that for every object you have to fit 30 models and then compute all these Bayes factors or whatever. And so I think in the end, maybe like a combination of the approach I'm talking about and the more model fitting could be best. Okay, so now I'm going to describe how to construct one particular type of classifier. I'm going to do this in a sort of abstract way first, and then actually apply it to a toy data set. Okay, so one method that was popular in the, I guess, 90s, still sometimes used, is CART, classification and regression trees. And this was developed by Leo Breiman. And the reason I'm going to talk about this method is twofold. One is it's fairly easy to see what's going on. And it's not maybe the greatest classifier, but it forms the basis for a popular method now called random forest, which people are using a lot actually on variable stars. So if you understand CART, then you almost understand random forest. And with a few more sentences, you can get what's going on with random forest. So to illustrate CART, suppose you just compute 2 features for every one of your light curves. So you can suppose that feature X is the period, and then the feature Y is the amplitude. And then we have 3 classes represented by black circles, yellow pluses, and blue triangles. So if you actually had this data, you would just like draw lines here, right? But in practice, you have a lot more features, so it's hard. You can't actually see. If you have 20 features, you can't see in 20-dimensional feature space. You can make scatter plots of a couple pairs of features, but you can't necessarily see the separation. So for illustrative purposes, I'm just going to use 2 features, but what I'm describing can be used for an arbitrary number of features where you wouldn't be able to just do things by eye. So how does CART work? So the idea here is that you partition feature space, and you try to partition feature space in a way that maximizes class separation. So suppose I propose a split here. So I'm going to say this is one area of feature space, this is another area of feature space. That split doesn't seem to do a particularly good job in separating classes, but a split like here might do a pretty good job, or maybe a split along here might do a good job. So what CART does is it essentially scans the features and then looks for a split which separates classes the best. And there's different ways for measuring class separation, and I think by default CART uses the Gini index, but there's different options there. But that would be built into the software that you're using to make this tree. So you can think about this split. What's sort of nice, and the reason why it's called classification and regression trees, is you can think about this split as being essentially a decision, where you're splitting on feature Y. So you ask, is feature Y greater than, or is feature Y less than 3.9? And then if feature Y is less than 3.9, then an object goes here and is labeled blue, and then Y is greater than 3.9, an object is labeled as orange. And this is a recursive algorithm, so once you've done one split, then the idea is to repeat that process, but focusing just on areas within the split. So you'll try to split this area of feature space, find a good cut, so probably here is going to be a good cut, and then find a good cut for features up here, maybe along here. So the next cut that CART chooses is kind of where you might do it by eye. And then you can see now that what you're doing is you're growing a tree. So here's the tree. So these 2 cuts can be represented in this tree structure, where first you ask, is Y less than 3.9? 0.39, if yes, then it's blue down here. If it's greater than 0.39, then the question is, what about the value of x, and is x greater than or less than 0.36? If yes, then black. If no, then orange. And you keep dividing up feature space like this. And you're growing this tree. So what's nice about the tree is, well, you can only plot this scatter plot when you have 2 dimensions, regardless of, or when you only have 2 features. Regardless of how many features you use, you can always make a tree, right? If you had 30 features, you period, derivatives, amplitude, all sorts of stuff. Those would just be quantities here. And then these would be the classes, Cepheid, Myra, whatever. So there's a bunch of questions that I've left out, like when do you stop making splits? So you could just make splits forever. So you have to decide when to stop splitting. So what people do is they sort of make lots of splits until they have very small regions, and then they kind of get rid of some splits. So it's called pruning the tree. And you want to do that in a way that minimizes misclassification, but you don't want to overfit, so you can do things with usually some form of cross-validation is used. And then you have test data. So test data is data that you use to evaluate the classifier performance. This would be a separate data set. You didn't use this data to make the classifier. So that's a somewhat common problem, is that if you use the same data to make the classifier and to evaluate the classifier performance, you tend to get optimistic error rates, in that you estimate an error rate that's lower than what it will be on new data. So by having test data, you have some set of data that you've kept separate, and then you know the labels for that data, but you use the classifier to predict labels, and then you can compare the predictions from the actual labels. And then there's a lot of ways to evaluate performance. One is you can just talk about error rates. Another is you can make a confusion matrix. So on the rows here are the true class for objects, and the columns are the predicted class. And you can see you want large numbers along the diagonal. This is when you're predicting or you're classifying things correctly. You can see that things that are actually orange get confused with things that are black more than they get confused with blue. It's probably because there's more overlap in feature space between orange and black. Okay. All right, so that's just a introduction to what classification is and how CART works. Now I'm going to apply it to, it's still a very toy data set, but actual astronomy data. So these are some OGLE light curves. So you can download all of this data. There's a link to the OGLE variable star data set on the last set of slides. So OGLE classified things into maybe 20 or so different classes, but I'm just taking 5 classes here. And I did this sort of deliberately to make some classes easy to separate and other classes hard to separate. So the 2 Myra subclasses are pretty difficult to separate. There isn't a lot of difference between O-rich and C-rich Myras in terms of the light curve shapes. There's some, but Myras should be fairly easy to separate from Cepheids and fairly easy to separate from Aurellari, because these have very different qualities. If you remember on the intro slides, the Myras have very large amplitude and long period, and the Aurellari have short periods and small amplitude. So you can extract as many features as you want, and I'll talk a little bit about what features people are using in articles that are being published in astronomy and statistics journals about this problem. But for this toy example, I extracted 4 features: the period, the amplitude, which I just defined to be the 95th percentile magnitude minus the 5th percentile, the skew of the magnitude measurements. This makes no use of time. I guess this doesn't make use of time either. And point-to-point scatter. I think that, I don't exactly remember what point-to-point scatter is, but I think you're looking at the residuals after fitting some function to the light curves. Okay, so once you do feature extraction, I have 500 light curves. And once you do feature extraction, you can represent these light curves just in a matrix where rows are objects, columns are features, and maybe you have an extra column for the class. And then I took 400 of these objects, 400 rows, randomly assigned those to be training, and 100 rows, randomly assigned those to be test. So this training and test are IID. They're like from the exact same group, the 500, and they were just randomly separated. Okay, so here's a scatter plot of the or scatter plot matrix of the 4 features with objects colored by the class they belong to. Do the astronomers have any comments on this? There's at least one interesting thing here.
I'm just sort of busy by all the information.
Right, I mean, anyone can have comments.
So where are the, so the axes we read off of those blocks in the middle, so like the one that's in the bottom right, the bottom row, third over, that has amplitude on the x-axis and p-to-p point-to-point scatter on the y-axis?
Yeah, so the point-to-point scatter, I'm not exactly sure what this feature represents, but it has values between 0 and 1.2, and...
Sorry, I'm just orienting myself to that style.
It seems like you can tell the difference between the different RR stars based on some combination of skew and point-to-point scatter that you can't really get from any of the other combinations of features. Like the bottom row or second one over.
This one?
Yeah, like everywhere else, the green and red are almost
identical. But these are separated pretty well in skew. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yes, the skew is almost like a single variable.
So I think one thing that an astronomer might notice, and a statistician is unlikely to notice this, but okay, so you have the 2 Myra classes are the blue triangle and the black plus. So Myras have to have long periods, like 100+ days. They can't have period under them. So if you look at period here, you'll see this is on a log scale. So 2 is 100 days. And most of the Myras do in fact have period greater than 2, which is greater than 100 days. But some of the Myras are down here at 1 or 0. So what's happened, so the reason for that is that, so you're estimating the period. You have some method, you're given some light curve, you estimate a period. But there's no guarantee that the period that's being returned by that method is actually correct. So you have errors in your period estimate. And what's interesting about that is if you're thinking just from the framework that I'm going to write down some classifier or make some cuts to find Myras, as an astronomer, you might say, I'm going to make a cut at 100 days because Myras have to have period greater than 100 days, which is correct. But you have to remember that the period that you have in some file is really an estimate of that period. That estimate could be wrong. And in fact, there's, in this case, there's a particular reason why it's always at this period value. That's an alias at 1 day, I think. And so even though you might think you should enforce all sorts of astronomical knowledge on this classifier, that can be misleading in some cases. Not that you should pretend that you don't know any astronomy, but you should recognize that features have errors in them, and it might make sense to classify something that has a period estimate of 1 day. It might make sense to classify that as a Myra.
Because it would be like really interesting if you have population of objects that's getting classified as a MIRA based on all the parameters, and then after the fact you say, okay, the period is completely unphysical, to use that as a way to find like unusual objects that aren't part of your classification training.
To use it to identify MIRAs that have wrong periods?
Well, they might not even be MIRAs, like you might have found a new kind of object.
Okay, yeah, so people are using classifiers that way, and I'll talk about a couple articles that have done things like that. The most classical use of classifiers doesn't do that, but yeah, that's a very important point in that the classification methodology as developed by statisticians and machine learners, I don't actually think quite fits with what astronomers want and need for variable stars, because there's a real need and desire for like outlier detection, and people are building classifiers and then saying they're trying to then coerce them or sort of into outlier detection methods.
So I come up with sort of similar to that. So how you know that some of the features might be necessitated, but you're certain of all the labels, or they also have errors?
Those could also have errors, and people try to build classifiers that are robust to mislabeling. Okay. So then you run CART on that data, and then it spits out a tree. So of course you can't see how these cuts would work in feature space because they don't. You can't actually project the cuts onto 2 dimensions, but you still have the tree, which is nice. So one thing that people really like about CART is that it's a highly interpretable classifier. What CART is doing, you can understand by plotting one of these trees, and then you can explain it to an astronomer, or if you are an astronomer, you can interpret it. Other methods, the trade-off there, even though CART's a very interpretable method, but it's considered somewhat less accurate than other methods. So there's somewhat of a tension between when you're choosing. There are lots of different classifiers. CART's one, support vector machines are another, neural networks are another, random forest is another. When you're choosing a classifier, there's a little bit of a tension between getting an accurate classifier and getting an interpretable classifier. So CART tends to be somewhat less accurate, but somewhat more interpretable than most other methods. And this is why people say it's interpretable, because once you fit the classifier, you print out this tree, and then you can look at how things are being classified. So what happens is you have an object, and first you look at what its period is, and if its period is greater than or equal to 0.42 days, you go here, and if its period is less than that, you label it an RRC. And then these 2 numbers are saying that there were 85 objects that had a period less than 0.42 days, and 85 out of 85 of them were in fact RRC. So that's a great cut to do, because you get like perfect period. And then you can do a cut on period to separate RRC from RRAB. So this is essentially saying that RRAB have periods greater than 0.42 days, but less than 0.89 days. So this should, if you're for variable star astronomers, this totally makes sense. All right, so you've gotten rid of your short period variable stuff, so you're just left with things that have periods greater than 0.89 days. And then you'd expect, MIRAs are large amplitude stars, so it makes sense to cut on amplitude. Things with a small amplitude should be Cepheids. Things with a larger amplitude are probably going to be MIRAs. So now you're kind of left, most of the objects that made it down here are MIRAs, and now you have to separate O-rich MIRAs from C-rich MIRAs, which is quite difficult. So things start to get a little bit less physical now. There's this point-to-point scatter feature, who knows what that's doing. And then there's some cut on period, which is in a range which doesn't even exist for MIRAs, but maybe more of the C-rich MIRAs have alias periods or something. It's sort of unclear as to why you would do this cut. But these cuts make a lot of sense, the first 3. And then you can, so you have that classifier, you had 100 light curves which were held out as test data. You can then predict the classes for those 100 objects, and then make this confusion matrix, and you can see what gets confused with what. And it's, as you would suspect, that things that are actually Cepheids are perfectly classified as Cepheids. C-rich Miras are almost always classified as either C-rich Miras or O-rich Miras, or they are always classified as either C-rich or O-rich, but the classifier is having a lot of trouble separating those two. Same thing with O-rich. And then R, A, B, and R, C. It looks like there's like one really bad error here where something was actually an R or A, B, but was classified as a Cepheid. That's kind of weird. And then if you're thinking about improving this classifier, you can see that what you have to do is find a way to separate O-rich and C-rich Miras. So this would focus your attention on feature extraction. So you can go back and then you can say, you know, what additional features might be useful for separating Miras. Okay, this is great. All right, so just some notes on classification in the astronomy and in the statistics literature. So here I've included 3 references. There's a lot more works. There's probably, over the past 10 years, been 20 or 30 additional articles that are doing something quite similar to what these are doing and what I described. But a few kind of relevant ones. So this first article was published by Jerry Richards and Josh Bloom from the Bloom Group. So they did this is published in AppJ on machine learning classification of variable stars. They use a mix of Ogle data and Hipparcos data. They extract a lot of features, like 50 plus features, and then they compared a lot of different classifiers. So one thing, they compared random forest with CART and support vector machines and a bunch of other things. So random forest, I haven't really described what that is, and so I'll do that now. So I said CART is classification and regression trees. So random forest is a classifier that seeks to remedy some of the deficiencies of CART and get you better classifications. And the way that that works is you build a lot of different trees, but you build them in a different way. So the way that you make sure that these trees aren't all the same is you do bootstrap sampling from your data to build each tree. So you have your data, you do a bootstrap sample, and you get a new data set, and you build a tree just on that data. The other thing that you do is when you're deciding whether you should, what variables to split on, you actually only include random subsets of variabilities in the set of variables you will consider. So if you have 50 features, when you're deciding for what initial variable to make a split on, you randomly throw out 40 of them and just you consider 10 features. It's kind of surprising that is good. But so what you end up doing is you make a lot of trees where you have randomization both from bootstrapping and both from only considering particular subsets of features for the splitting. So you'll have in R, the default is to grow 500 trees. Hence you have a forest because you have a lot of trees. And then you average the results together of the trees.
How can you average them if they have different variables?
They use different variables, but each tree is predicting a class for your object. So you can, if you have 300 trees that are predicting RLIRA and 200 that are predicting Cepheid, then you would, for this object, you would call it an RLIRA.
I'm sorry, for this object you need.
So I have 500 trees that I've grown, I have an object, I don't know what class it belongs to, so I use every one of these 500 trees to predict.
But you don't average the criteria in the trees.
No.
And then you keep all the trees.
Yeah, you keep all the trees. Yeah, sorry, wrong use of the word average. So there's also some differences with CART so I talked with CART, you do this pruning where you grow the tree and then you get rid of some of the terminal nodes. And you don't really do that with random forest. You actually grow the trees very deep and then you just leave them that way. I don't think it's fully understood why random forest works. It's very difficult to analyze in a theoretical perspective. Like for statisticians love to prove stuff about methods. And it's very, very difficult to prove things about random forest. But there's a lot of empirical evidence that it works well on a wide variety of problems. And the creator of the method, he provides a lot of like heuristic thinking as to why it works. But there isn't like some like guarantee that's the best or better than CART. But it's kind of a well-respected method. It's used in a lot of fields. So random forest, this problem is only one of like hundreds or thousands which random forest has been used on. So that's one paper that came out 5 years ago. Around the same time, another group used just the Parkhurst data. They extracted many fewer features. They also used random forest. Kind of similar results there. This third paper gets a little bit at what Sheila was saying in terms of doing modeling. So far, I've just talked about feature extraction where you compute fairly simple features. This guy's a statistician, Julian Faraway, modeled light curves using Gaussian processes and then kind of extracted features from the model fits. And he demonstrated that improved classification on some data sets. One very nice thing that they did was a sort of a robustness analysis, which I'll talk about more next week. So this was published in a statistics journal, the ASA journal, Machine Learning and Data Science or something. So this is written in a way that's very accessible to statisticians, and they worked very hard to make everything they did super reproducible. So that would be a good, if you're interested in classifiers and variable stars, and you want a project where you reproduce something in the literature, this would be a good choice, I think, because they really laid out all the data. Okay, so I'm going to end there for today. On next Wednesday, we'll continue with these slides. So I'll talk about selecting training data. So remember, we have some data set we want to classify. Where do we get our training data from? I'll talk about sort of other approaches. So Sheila mentioned, well, I want to find outliers, or how do we go beyond just the classes that we have? So to some extent, you can do that with clustering, and I'll talk a little bit about outlier detection. And then, so that will probably take about half of, so that will take, finishing these slides will probably take about half of next lecture. And then some other things I'll talk about over the next 2 weeks. Talk maybe more about trying to do real-time classification. So for some of this stuff, you can do it offline. Your telescope collects the data, it sits on a server for a year, and then you classify it. But other things you need to classify like right away. So an example of this is supernova. Supernova goes off. You need to know like within the next hour that happened, and that wasn't just some something else, and maybe some bug in your pipeline or some asteroid or whatever. For some problems, there's a real-time aspect to the classification. With LSST-sized data, there's also computational constraints. So I'll talk a little bit about that, especially in the context of why don't we fit models? If we have models for some of these variable stars and classes, can we fit models? I think there definitely is a place for that, but we may be thinking about that in the context of computational constraints. Okay, and then I didn't talk about much about what you actually do once you've done the classification, the classification definitely is not the final step with this data. So a big use of variable stars is something called the Period-Luminosity Relationship, which is in turn used for distance determination or distance estimation. So I'll talk about that. That's getting a little bit more into the astronomy. And I think that will help clarify some of the importance of doing classification and also suggest what methods might be useful. And then finally, we might talk about scheduling of observations. So suppose you have some objects and you think that this belongs to class A, but you're not sure. Maybe you have some telescope time that you could use to get more data on that object and then to make a more certain classification. So that's a problem that astrostatisticians are thinking about, especially in the context of exoplanet data, but also for, to some extent, for variable stars. So that's a summary of the next 2 weeks. And I'll be around for the next hour here, or half hour. So if you want to ask me any questions. Otherwise, I will see you next week.